Nan Wang, thank you so much for sitting down with me. It's always my favorite conversations when I can sit with entrepreneurs, and in this case, sit with somebody who's created a product that is so near and dear to my heart. So thank you so much for having this conversation with me today. First of all, tell me a little bit about yourself. Tell me about Sleeper and just how it came about.
Sure, Rich. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be on the pod. So Sleeper really was born out of a lifetime of loving sports and enjoying it with my friends. And so we've got three co-founders on our team. Most of us have been playing fantasy sports for 15 to 20 years. In fact, my CTO and co-founder I've been friends since 5 years old with, and our league's been around for 18 years since college. And for us, that fantasy experience is really an excuse to hang out. And our group chats, our WhatsApps around sports are really a reason for us to check in on each other, see how our families are doing, and really to share in the emotions that sports have to offer with each other. And so we fundamentally felt that that was a missing piece of what was being offered out there. Nobody had created a social app around sports. You have to piece it together by going onto Facebook, onto Twitter, onto Reddit, in the email and text threads. And so we decided to build an app where the messaging was the core, really to reinforce these friendships. And then we overlaid fantasy leagues on top so you can actually game as well.
So the social component, I know I've been in a league for 15, 20 years as well. And it's unbelievable because these are almost like camp friends. They're people that you talk to for like those 4 or 5 months of the year, and then you kind of lose touch, but there's nobody that you're closer with during that time. The social component of it and the leagues and the things that you've added to this point, it feels like you've done it in a very kind of efficient manner in terms of what you've introduced. Was the idea originally to have leagues, or was it at first to create a social destination for people to communicate?
That's a great question. The original focus was how do we create a social experience around sports? And so we started by delivering news and alerts to communities of sports fans so that they could react to breaking news. And that quickly grew to over 100,000 users on the platform, and people were spending anywhere from half an hour to 45 minutes on game days just checking news, reacting to it, emoting, smack talking. And we found that all the conversations naturally led back to how the news impacted their fantasy league.
Yeah.
And so that really led us down the path of exploring a little bit further. We started talking to the users, and it was clear that almost everybody had these group chats and these fantasy leagues that they played in. And for them, that was the central way they consumed sports stats, news, information, highlights. And really, it was the impact of their leagues that they cared about. And so when we rolled out leagues 2 years ago, we really hit the sweet spot for what was missing in the market, which was a functioning league software that had the social embedded into it. And over the past 2 years, we've been the fastest organically growing sports app in the US. So crossed over 1 million active users on the platform this past season. The league's been growing 7 to 8x year over year, really because these are essentially groups of 10 people that are clustering together to hang out over sports. And if you create the right product, every user invites 9 or 10 other people to join the platform. And so we benefited from organic viral growth without really spending on user acquisition.
And how old is the business?
We incorporated in 2015, so been around for 5 years. Leagues have been around for 2 years, and it had always been a sticky product, but when we launched leagues, it became viral as well.
So is there still a component of your app where people are engaged in a CBS league or an ESPN league and then utilize you for the social platform? Or is it the kind of thing now where you kind of have to use the app for both?
There's still remnants of people who have not made the change yet, but less and less so.
Yeah.
I think as we start getting the groundswell of people talking about how great the product is and how over the course of the season, having the chat embedded allows them to have more interactions with their friends, we're seeing groups migrate en masse. And so we're taking users from existing incumbent platforms. But more importantly than that, I think we're also growing the market. If you think about a fantasy user, the old stereotype is it's somebody who's really stat heavy, who's a diehard sports fan, but it could really be further from the truth. Most fantasy leagues are started in office places and are an excuse for water cooler conversation, or it's your college classmates and roping in, diehards and casuals just to stay in touch. And so we created an app that makes it easy for commissioners to set up a league, invite their friends, and for somebody who's new to sports to learn and pick it up in 30 seconds or less. And as a result, we've also grown the casual market, and that's reflected in the stats. So on traditional fantasy sites, 1 out of 10 of the users are female. we're 3 out of 10 and growing.
Yeah.
And we're also tapping into a younger, more casual demographic. So 65% of our users are below the age of 35. And so a lot of things are going really well in terms of focusing on simplicity, the social element. How do we remove barriers to participation?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. It does make sense to me because it feels like it's usually started, a league is started by somebody who does know everything about sports, then gets all their friends who may not necessarily know as much, but they get down with the kind of game aspect of it all. And then all of a sudden they become sports fans and they crave that information. So what are the current products? It's football and basketball?
It's football. We actually were designing an NBA product and a March Madness product. Obviously, with the cancellation or the postponement of the season and the cancellation of March Madness, we're going to reintroduce that in the fall when sports comes back. But we've also launched a League of Legends product a week ago, which captures the growing esports opportunity. So a lot of development is going into the product pipeline. We've got soccer and other esports on the pipeline for next year as well.
So was esports something that was always slated to come out around now, or was it sped up due to the pandemic?
It was sped up. So we had always had it on the roadmap, but it was a 2021, I guess, development item for us. Our team has actually been play testing the game for the last 18 months. We come from a familiarity to the space. So like my CTO is a Diamond League of Legends player. One of my other co-founders is like one level below Challenger in Dota. We've got LAN parties on Friday instead of going out to the bar, and we play Valorant together. And so esports is part of our DNA and an opportunity that we ultimately wanted to capture. But it was 1 year out. But given COVID, I think one of the things we were seeing where people were still dying for a way to hang out with their friends in our product. And in the absence of basketball, we wanted to expedite kind of the development of esports to offer that experience for users. It really helped me get through this kind of shelter at home situation.
So how does the app play into esports? What's the actual component of gaming and the fantasy?
It's very similar to how a fantasy basketball or football product works. You draft a roster of, in this case, 5 pro players. And then whatever they do in their tournaments or their matchups plays out in terms of statistical categories that represent how you do in your fantasy leagues. The added difference for what we introduced is this element called picks and bans. And so for anybody who plays League of Legends, there's this added step of you need to choose which champion or character your opponent uses. And if you ban them, they can't use them. And then your own player has to choose who they want to use in the matchup as well. And so it adds strategy and depth to the fantasy experience where if I ban the right player for my opponent, it negates their scoring. And if I choose the right player for my player, it doubles up on the scoring and gives me bonuses. And it's really important that I kind of talk a little bit about that because I think one of the things broken with almost every fantasy sport outside of football is the lack of game balance. There's not enough strategy in it to retain a user over a long period of time. And so you need to have something for them to actually have the ability to research for a couple hours on end to make that one decision, to make it fun and exciting. That way, when I beat you, I can rub it in your face.
Yeah.
It doesn't exist for esports in its current format. It doesn't exist for basketball. And so we're also fundamentally designing a new fantasy experience around the NBA as well. If you think about how the NBA product plays out now, it's 6 months of a season and there's a game every single day. And so the only decision you make is, does my player play today? If so, start them. And let's be real, I will never sub KD out for anyone. And so there really isn't that depth of strategy involved into decision making. It just becomes rote manual work over 6 months of updating lineups. And so after 4 weeks, people start getting bored and they drop off. And so for basketball, we're making people choose the matchup that the player is likely to outperform. And so if KD's got 3 games this week and I think he's going to go off against the Cavs, I'm going to start KD against the Cavs and then let that play out. And what it does is it introduces decision-making where I have to analyze the matchup, whether it's a home or away game, whether it's a back-to-back, coaching decisions, roster decisions, and it introduces volatility into the single game outcome as well, which makes it more exciting and makes me want to watch that game even more.
Yeah. I feel like you guys have a really big opportunity with basketball because I've never felt like fantasy basketball truly like clicked with consumers clearly the way fantasy football has. And at least for me, who's like an avid fantasy football player and an avid basketball fan, I've just never been able to truly like connect with playing fantasy basketball. So how big is the fantasy sports business? How big is the market?
For esports or for fantasy sports?
Well, first for fantasy sports.
So fantasy sports, the FSGA, which is the industry research arm, claims there's 60 to 65 million players in the U.S. Primarily,
Wow.
it's NFL football, as we kind of alluded to earlier. But there is really no reason why that shouldn't be bigger. Basketball is a much bigger global sport than football. Soccer is a much bigger global sport than football. It's really about game balance. And so if we achieve our mission of building a balanced social game with the chat that matters to every single sports fan, then we're actually not looking at a fantasy demographic. We're looking at every sports fan, which is 2 to 3 billion, users across the world. And so that's ultimately what we're driven by. How do we create that social experience for every fan, not just
Yeah.
the fantasy fan? Esports is a growing category. There's 100 million players of League of Legends alone. And so it ranks right up there with any of the major sports right out of the gate.
Yeah. So esports obviously has such a incredible trajectory in terms of what it could mean to the app. Do you feel like there's a different consumer that you have to kind of think about how you market and how you onboard as you did for basketball and football?
For sure, for sure. It's a much younger demographic. So for traditional sports, what we were finding is it's 14 to 35 is our core demographic. For esports, it's 8 to 26. And so there is a little bit of a kind of an age discrepancy there. Esports also tends to be a lot more international than our NFL users. We see users in Korea, in Brazil, in Europe, in China, who are really, really avid League of Legends, Valorant, Dota, CSGO players. And so we need to fundamentally think about how do we become international from day one when we launch the product. We need to also really think about not just cross-pollination of our existing users, but how do we identify new pockets of users, either through influencer strategies, through kind of our own in-app growth features, or through seeding it with paid acquisition. So all of these things are being kind of worked on as we develop the product in parallel. We're excited to announce that our League of Legends product will be international out of the gate. And so it's our first international product, and the NBA will be as well.
So how do you guys make money? What's the philosophy behind building the business to profitability?
Yeah, and I think this goes hand in hand with the whole scaling comment I made earlier. It's reduce friction for users to participate on the product. And so we've avoided banner ads and affiliate deals, despite being approached for both. And the goal is not to create any friction for people to hate Sleeper. We want to create a pure experience for them to enjoy it. And I don't know of any other messenger product that has ads in it. And so that's at scale at least. And so for us, we've had to think really creatively about how do we monetize and offset server costs while we scale in a value added way to users. And we've introduced this concept called virtual mascots and virtual avatars. And essentially what it is it's a Street Fighter overlay on your fantasy league, where you can get a digital character that reacts to plays that are happening in real time, and they battle it out on game day. And so it does a couple things. One, it taps into a younger audience. Two, it's more casual. So it's no longer just about numbers, but is actually more immersive on game day for you to have something to watch and react to. And it's more social because you can use these avatars in the chat and taunt your friends. And so we've used that as a way to kind of continue to monetize as we scale, where we're also delivering value back to the end user as a result. And so that's been a pretty good product launch. We launched it last year and are doubling down. We're working on IP deals right now, which we'll be announcing pretty soon to get even more mascots into the store. But it's a very promising feature.
That's great, man. So what's the next kind of like secret behind closed doors of where Sleeper could go? I know esports, like you said, basketball, March Madness. Is there something that we haven't spoken about that you could let me in on a bit?
Yeah, so I'll break the news here, but we're working on a foundational chat infrastructure to enable people to have that draft party experience, even though they're apart. And so one of the things we're realizing is that COVID might be drawn out for a couple more months, and we might not be able to have people over for pizza and a draft anymore. And so how do we replicate that experience? And we're exploring voice and video chat embedded into your fantasy draft. And so imagine if you could do a Zoom with all of your friends and draft at the same time. And so we're building that for the fall,
That's
really
awesome.
just double down on social.
That's really cool. I think that's a very clear necessity for all of us as we look forward to our August and early September draft gatherings. I know I am, and have been thinking about what we'll make of that kind of occasion. So I got to bring my league over to Sleeper.
Please do.
Um, I definitely will. Well, listen, then there's nothing I love more than talking to other entrepreneurs, and especially when you know you're talking to someone who loves what they're doing. And I know from one sports fan to another, if you can do what you do and your work consists of being around sports and the games that you grew up loving, there's nothing better. So congratulations on all your success. I'm excited to keep watching the steps that you guys take in the future, and I'm glad that we could be a small part of it and help where we can. And Sleeper is something that I think has really got a bright future ahead of it.
Thank you, Rich. Really appreciate the opportunity.